This is session 3 for AS level history, Column Cymru. This is for unit 1 and top option 8, which is on Europe in an age of conflict and cooperation from 1890 to 1991. So in session 1 and 2, Mr. Morell focused on the same unit, but looked at the topic of international relations from 1890 to 1939. In these two sessions now, I'm going to look at the impact of revolution in Russia from 1905 to 1945. I'll cover the first half of that in this session and the later time period in session 4 next week. So if you look at the topic checklist I've got here, this session will focus on the first two. So the main causes and effects of the 1905 revolution, the main cause of revolution in 1917, and then next week's session will focus on civil war and the Bolshevik consolidation of power and the impact of Stalin's political, social and economic changes from 1928 to around 1945. Now, we have gone through this in previous sessions, but this is how the exam paper looks, okay? And if you want a detailed session on exam technique, Mr. Morell has looked at those previously. So this session will address it. However, the main focus will be on content for Russia 1905 to 1945. So if you look at this, you'll get 4 questions, 2 in section A and 2 in section B. You have to answer 1 from each section. So you, in whatever topic area you're doing, there'll be 5 options and we'll cover 4. Now, only answer 1 from section A and 1 from section B. Obviously, it's important that you revise all of the units just in case you don't like the wording of the question. Section B will often cover a longer time period. So it's important that you do cover that time period. You don't cover every year, but you need to pick something like a theme or an event from across that time period. So I wanted to give some examples of questions you might be asked on Russia. So if you were to revise, make sure you're thinking about these things. Now, because the question asks about impact, it's likely that the question that you get in the exam will also focus on that. Okay, so you've got things like the most significant changes in Russia in the period between 1905 and 1945 came under Lenin, discussed. And obviously, like the other questions we mentioned, you need to consider the key concept, which is most significant. You weigh that up against other options. Is something more significant, less significant? It's important that you have a debate around that key concept. It's important that you discuss the key factor in that question, which is under Lenin. And it's also important you address the time period. So from 1905 to 1945, they'd be expecting you to cover aspects from all of this topic area. You've got another similar question there, which looks at Stalin's domestic policies having the most significant impact. Again, identify that key concept, most significant impact. You need to make sure you are focusing on that and debating that. Remember the time period, 1905 to 1945. Then the other question, the lives of the people of Russia were affected more by repression than by any other government action in the period 1905 to 1945. So again, think about, well, was it that repression that had the most significant impact? Was there anything else? And again, consider the pros and cons of all of that. And I'll discuss that in a second now. Collectivization of agriculture had the greatest impact on the lives of the Russian people in the period 1924 to 1945. It's a different time period there. So you need to make sure that you don't consider what happened under the Tsar or Lenin. That's a focus then on what happened under Stalin. And you're debating that concept of greatest impact. So you're thinking of things that might have had a greater impact. In that paragraph on collectivization of agriculture, make sure you consider the cons. Why would it suggest it wasn't the greatest impact? And then if you have that question, how effectively did Russian governments deal with the challenges they faced in the period from 1905 to 1945? That key concept there of effectively, make sure you debate in that. Okay, in every paragraph, I should think about the extent of how effective it was. So I should see arguments that support that it was effective, but also consider the other argument as well. So to recap then on what we expect in these A-level style questions, for one of those that I've gone through, Stalin's domestic policies had the most significant impact on Russia between 1905 and 1945. Now, it's important for a Band 6 response that you remain fully focused on the key concept, which I've highlighted there for you. Most significant impact. You need to debate that. You also have to make sure you cover the time period. So 1905 to 1945. Okay. If you were to discuss just Stalin's time as leader of Russia, you've missed out the Tsar, you've missed out Lenin. It's crucial that you cover the full time period in the question. Make sure you support any of your arguments with detailed historical knowledge to move it from assertion to argument. Okay, everything you say should be supported and then explained. Analyze and evaluate the key concepts. So consider the pros and cons. It isn't like GCSE, where you could just have a paragraph on Stalin's domestic policies and then move on to others. You need to rip that apart. Why could you argue that it had the most significant impact? And why could you argue against that as well? So every paragraph requires evaluation. And then finally, it's important that you reach a supported judgment on that question in your conclusion, where you weigh up all of the arguments. Okay, you don't discuss anything new, but you tie all of your arguments together and address that question. So what I wanted to point out that as it's A-level, it's important that you read around the topics. So as well as what I go through today, it's very difficult to cover the whole of these two topics that I'm covering today on the 1905 revolution and the revolutions of 1917. I can't cover all of the content, so it's important that you read through this yourselves. You go through the other Carl and Cymru sessions, and you also go back through your class notes, as well as the WJEC resources that are provided online. So before I go through it, there's two keywords I want to make you aware of that you need to understand this unit. Revolution, obviously it's in the title, so it's unlikely you don't know what that is, but the definition is a forcible overthrow of a government in favor of a new system, a massive part of this unit on Russia. And also, when we're thinking about the Tsar as an autocratic ruler, it's important you understand autocracy. So a system of government by one person with absolute power. Okay, so, and also, like I mentioned there, the ruler of Russia before 1917, before the February Revolution, is the Tsar. And the only Tsar we're going to focus on for our time period is Tsar Nicholas II. Now, I'm going to go through some background knowledge so you understand the situation in Russia in 1905, the start of our course. So this is what Tsar Nicholas II said when he knew he was going to become Emperor of Russia. So what is going to happen to me, to all Russia? I'm not ready to be the Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling. I have no idea of even how to talk to ministers. Now, you need to understand this is not a man who is ready to take over. Okay, he's not someone who wants to be Tsar, but he's someone who feels strongly about that autocratic rule, that no one should be able to question his authority. He believes in the divine right of kings. He was chosen by God, so he cannot be questioned. So I'm going to go through some key points about what Russia was like at the start of our time period. Now, we are talking about a massive country that spans two continents, Europe and Asia. 8 million square miles of land. And obviously these details are not something you're going to have to bring up because we're not telling a story. It's important we analyze and evaluate, but it's important to understand what a difficult country this is to rule. 6,000 miles wide east to west, 3,000 miles in length north to south, occupied an area of Europe greater than the rest of Europe put together, and occupied an area of Asia 3 times greater than the size of Europe. Absolutely massive. Okay, the largest country on earth. Okay, now you've got people from a range of nationalities. You've got a range of languages, religions, ethnic groups. Now the majority were Christian, but there were also 25 million Muslims and 5 million Jews in the country. So you're dealing with a very diverse country. From 1850 to 1900, the population had doubled from 65 million to 130 million. 80% of the population lived and worked on the land, and 70% of the population were illiterate. So you're dealing with a country that's made up of mostly peasants. Now, this is the first topic area on this unit on Russia, and that's the main causes and effects of the 1905 revolution. So even though it's important you know the events, that is not my priority here. It's important you understand the causes and then the effects, the consequences of that 1905 revolution, because it is not going to ask you to tell the story of the 1905 revolution. So this was the first real threat to Tsar Nicholas II's rule. And the main events, like I said, I'm not going to spend too much time on them because we slip into telling a story. During this revolution, strikes spread across the country, illegal trade unions were widespread, Nicholas II's uncle was assassinated, and there was a mutiny aboard the battleship Potemkin. You'll see that whenever that happens, it does suggest that whoever's in charge is losing support. When we look at Lenin, you'll see that when he's worried that he's losing the support of those, he does adapt the war communism to the new economic policy. So he does respond to that. There's also a general strike in October. So these are the main events of that 1905 revolution. But it's more important that we understand the causes of that revolution. So there's a number of long-term and short-term causes, which I'm going to go through. Okay, you could have a question. We have to consider the causes of issues over this time period. Okay, and our long-term causes, so things that have been happening over a number of years. Okay, we've got political problems and we've got economic problems. And then you've got short-term causes, things that happen closer to the event, like the defeat in the war with Japan. And then you've got a short-term cause, which could also be considered the spark to that event, the spark that resulted in the 1905 revolution, which is Bloody Sunday. So the first one then I'm going to look at is the political problems in Russia in 1905, okay, or before that, because it's a longer term one. Okay, you got Jewish people being persecuted in Russia. You got ethnic minorities being oppressed by the policies of Russification, so being forced into the culture of Russia and being expected to live in exactly the same way. Okay, any officials criticizing the government in 1900 were purged, so you couldn't speak out against the Tsar. If you did, that would lead to the Okhrana arresting you and possibly sending you to exile. Middle-class industrialists were unhappy that they had no say in how the country was governed. So it's not just the peasants that have a problem, it's also those fairly higher up. Okay. Industrialization and urbanization at this time had led to more social and economic problems, especially for workers and peasants. Now, also, you've got revolutionary groups that I'm going to look at in a second that are growing in support. Even though they are not allowed at that time, you do have growing support for these. And like I've mentioned previously, this use of terror. So the Okhrana were used by the Tsar to wipe out any opposition. So you could say that they led to some of the issues in Russia at that point. There was also opposition that I mentioned in terms of political parties that were illegal at the time, but were starting to grow. Now, liberals were very critical of the Tsar. However, they didn't want to remove him like communist parties would. They wanted the introduction of a state Duma, which is a parliament. They'd advise the Tsar, but he gave them that role they wanted, not to remove him, but have a say in Russian politics. Now, you also have Marxism, you might know as communism, the idea spreading through Russia from the 1880s. Okay, the belief that the proletariat, the underclass of society, would rise up and rebel and seize power from the ruling classes. Now, one of these political parties that followed the ideas of Karl Marx were the social revolutionaries. Now, they wanted to overthrow the government in favor of giving power to the peasants. Then you had the Social Democrats, who fully believed in the idea of communism or Marxism. That it wasn't for the peasants to overthrow the Tsar. They wanted the workers to push this. After disagreements in 1903, the Social Democrats split into two. So the Mensheviks, led by Martov, they wanted a revolution by the workers to occur naturally, and they wanted it to be more democratic, where the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, believed revolution should come as soon as possible, and then it should be led by a small group of communists, which ultimately we know that's what happened. Another long-term cause was the economic problems at the time. Over 3/4 of the Russian population were unhappy with their position in the empire. So you got peasants and workers suffering horrendous living and working conditions. Now, focus first on peasants then. There was widespread famine in Russia before 1905. Now, they've been freed from serfdom in 1861. However, they were expected to pay landowners for the land they lived on. Okay, the peasant had to pay this loan back to the state in the form of redemption payments. So they were still tied to that land. As well as this, you have anger among the workers because of the working conditions. Protests and strikes, even though they were illegal, were on the increase in the early 1900s. By 1905, when the revolution took place, they were widespread. Now, before 1905, the population of Russia's towns and cities had multiplied by 4, and the working conditions were horrendous. Trade unionism was banned, so there was very little to protect their pay, their working hours, their safety at work. Okay. Some had to live in communal houses, similar to in the army. Some even had to sleep in the factories they were working in. And now we move on to a short-term cause. Now, when they go to war with Japan in 1904, they think that it's going to be an easy victory. And they do get behind the Tsar. They do show their support because they expect to be able to defeat Japan fairly easily. However, this was not the case. It was a humiliating defeat for Russia, and criticism was aimed at the Tsar. So he had to agree a humiliating peace treaty with the Japanese, and this led to further criticism of the Tsar. There was a mutiny on board the Potemkin battleship, and I mentioned that previous. That's not what you don't want to lose support from those. And the final cause then, which I said is a short-term cause, but also the spark that started this 1905 revolution, which lasted for a number of months. So a priest, Father Gapon, organized a petition complaining about working conditions in the city and calling for change. Now, his aim was to deliver this petition to the Tsar. So they took part in a very peaceful protest. And when they arrived at the Winter Palace, the Tsar wasn't there, but Russian soldiers shot at the demonstrators. So up to 200 people were killed. And this was clearly something that sparked then this 1905 revolution. Okay. Now, during this revolution, you have riots, you have strikes, the Tsar loses control. However, he does manage to, which we look at the effects, to agree to introduce something called the October Manifesto, and the army come back and do stabilize the situation in Russia. Now, I got that there. So after months of strikes and rioting, in order to restore order, the October Manifesto is issued by the Tsar. He promises State Duma, which is a state parliament, elected by the people. He promised civil rights. He promised the right to form political parties. And the liberals and middle class stop their protest, and then the troops are back to take control. So that happens in December 1905. If there's anything you're unsure about with those, either go back through, the presentation will be uploaded, or you can ask me any questions when me and Mr. Rel do the live sessions next week. So moving on then, we look at the effects of this 1905 revolution. Now, Sergei Witte was an influential policymaker. He persuaded the Tsar to pass the October Manifesto. So this manifesto would outline promises of change. So he does promise some things that especially the liberals wanted. Okay, he promised political reform. So he promised a state Duma, which is state parliament, saying it would be set up, and no law could be passed without the Duma agreeing it. Censorship would be loosened, and there'd be more freedom of speech. Okay. So this new government was set up, the state Duma, and straight away, 1906, the Tsar backed down on his promises. So he passed the fundamental laws. Now, these laws meant that if he didn't like what he saw in the State Duma, he could close it down. He could dissolve the Duma at any point. And there are a number of instances where he did dissolve the Duma until he had people in there, politicians, that he agreed with. So if he heard somebody he didn't like, he'd remove them. And also, he continued to use the army and the Krana to suppress any opposition. So this 1905 revolution had led to some changes. However, they didn't last long. The State Duma stayed in place. However, their powers were limited by these fundamental laws that he introduced. So take a minute then to have a look through these key points that you should know from the causes and effects of the 1905 revolution. If you can't, say, put a tick next to each of these to understand them, it's important you go back through them, have a look at your class notes, but these are things I'd expect my students to understand for this unit on Russia. So I'll give you a minute to read through before I move on. So hopefully the session now has made you understand that first topic on the Russian aspect of the course, the main cause and effects of the 1905 revolution. So now I'm going to look at the cause of revolution in 1917. Now, there's two revolutions in 1917 that I'm going to look at. Is the February Revolution, where the people overthrow the Tsar, and then the October 1917 revolution, where the Bolsheviks overthrow the provisional government. Now, we've got a number of issues that lead to this February Revolution in 1917. So we know that Tsar Nicholas II was a poor leader. Very good, this unit, because a lot of the issues that were clear in the 1905 revolution are still an issue, issues that have been ignored. So political problems of the Tsar. You've got the economic problems. You've also got another war, this one on a bigger scale, having a bigger impact on Russia. Rather than the humiliation, you've actually got the First World War, which has a massive impact directly on Russia. So this February Revolution that I'm going to discuss leads to the abdication of the Tsar. So he has no choice but to step down. And so I've covered political problems in three areas there. I've got his incompetence, which we know already. The Tsar's wife, the Tsarina, was very unpopular, and also issues with Rasputin, the monk that they put a lot of trust into, and they were heavily criticized for trusting that man. Now, I'll start with the incompetence of Nicholas II then. He was unable to rule effectively. He made many poor decisions, which led to a difficult life for a lot of civilians and soldiers. He refused to accept any reduction in his absolute power. He also, in the First World War, declares himself commander-in-chief of the army. He goes to the Eastern Front to take control of operations. However, he had no understanding or no education in the tactics of war. So he wasn't having any positive impact on the war front, but also he left a weakened government back home then, what is now known as Petrograd, previously mentioned as St. Petersburg. We also have some issues with the Tsarina. So the Tsar's wife, Tsarina Alexandra, was left in control when he is on the war front. She wasn't popular in Russia. It says there she was reserved and awkward in public. However, they were suspicious of her because she was a German princess. She had a massive influence over the appointment of ministers to the government. And then this leads nicely on to the loyalty she showed Grigory Rasputin. Now, he was a monk from Siberia who she believed was healing her son, but he was infamous for his drunkenness and for his womanizing, and he symbolized everything that was wrong with the Tsar and his regime. They become objects of ridicule. Now, he is murdered by royalists in 1916, so before the 1917 revolution. However, the humiliation and damage had been done by that point. Also, the First World War is having a massive impact on Russia. So it brings suffering for soldiers and civilians. Okay, the best estimates state that almost 2 million Russian soldiers were killed. Numbers of civilians also died. Morale was low, and there was very little support for the war effort. And the person who was blamed for all of these issues was Tsar Nicholas II, because he took personal command of the army. They had defeats at the hands of Germany, which he would be blamed for. Also, the economic problems that were clearly there in Russia would be made worse by the First World War. So by the beginning of 1917, just before the Tsar abdicated, the country was facing virtual economic collapse. So Russian industry was in crisis. Vital raw materials from overseas couldn't reach Russia. They had shortages of raw materials and finished goods. And also the army faced major shortages of supplies and weapons. Their railway system was underdeveloped. It was taken over by the government to be used for the war effort, but it meant that the cities couldn't be supplied with food. Agricultural methods were backwards. Now, a lot of peasant farmers were conscripted into the army. Now, this meant there weren't enough peasants on the farms anymore, which meant further reduction in producing food. And then in 1916, inflation had reached 200%. So these massive issues, you've got the political problems with the Tsar, you've got the impact of the First World War, and you've got these economic problems, all leading to then the Tsar having to abdicate in February 1917. So demonstrations and food riots started to break out in Petrograd. He'd clearly lost support and control. He didn't realize what a threat it was. He was on the war front. He didn't realize how bad things had got. Now, his soldiers were ordered to fire on the mob, and many refused and either deserted or joined the protests. So the Tsar did give up the throne in February 1917, and the provisional government was formed. So Russia was now a republic, with no monarch. Okay. Now, the reason it's called a provisional government, this provisional government set up in February 1917, is that the idea was it would only be there temporarily. They deal with the problems and then they would hold an election. Okay, so only after 8 months, this provisional government was replaced by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. So it's clear that they were unable to deal with the problems that the Tsar was unable to deal with. So one of the first main problems is that they had an unofficial partnership with the Petrograd Soviet. So basically an unofficial government that had the support of workers and soldiers. So it was established in March 1917 as a representative body of the city's workers and soldiers. So they regarded its role as supervisor to represent workers and soldiers. So they were willing to show support for the provisional government unless there was something they disagreed with. Now, imagine having workers and soldiers on your side. You are able to bring that country to a standstill. So the provisional government were limited because of that unofficial partnership. Now, workers and soldiers were told that they should obey the provisional government, but if they went against the Petrograd Soviet, this unofficial government, then they should listen to the Petrograd Soviet first. Now it's clear that the Soviet had the most power. They've got support of soldiers, factory workers, and they're able to bring the country to a standstill if they wanted. Now, Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland. He was brought back with the help of the Germans. Now, when he came back, he wanted to have a communist revolution now. Now, not straight away. They do agree that they will show some support for the provisional government. You've got Trotsky, who is a Bolshevik, who is working as part of the Petrograd Soviet. Now, when he returned, he outlined his April theses. Now, this is what he promised the people. So he promised peace, bread, and land. And these would deal with the issues that the provisional government and the Tsar were unable to deal with. So he would bring about peace, he would bring an end to the First World War, he would provide food, and he would make sure the peasants had their own land. So this April thesis did lead to Lenin gaining support. So in July then, armed groups ruled the streets and rioting was widespread. However, this lacked any leadership. So the leader of the provisional government blamed the Bolsheviks for this. So he closed down the Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda. Trotsky and Kamenev, two leading Bolsheviks, were arrested. Lenin had to flee to Finland. And they launched a propaganda campaign in which Lenin and the Bolsheviks were branded as traitors and German agents. Now, this looked as if the Bolshevik party were finished in Russia. Okay, this chaos of the July days had led to the downfall of the Bolsheviks. However, in September 1917, then, the Russian commander-in-chief, General Kornilov, turned his army back from the war front and marched against the provisional government, trying to seize power. Now, they had no choice, the provisional government. They wanted to stay in power to give weapons to the Bolsheviks and the Petrograd Soviet. Now, the Bolshevik Red Guards, led by Trotsky, did stop his advance because his soldiers deserted him and fled. Now, obviously, Trotsky played a massive role in this. Because he had given so much authority to the Bolsheviks, given them weapons, trusting them, they were now a real power in Russia. So they now plan to seize political power from the provisional government. So Trotsky already holds power in the Petrograd Soviet. So then we've got this second revolution I mentioned, the October Revolution. So led by Trotsky, the Military Revolutionary Committee was able to secure the support of the Petrograd garrison and the Kronstadt sailors. So on the 24th of October, the Prime Minister Kerensky tried to limit Bolshevik influence. He ordered the arrest of many of their leaders. However, the Military Revolutionary Committee decided to take action. So the Red Guards and the Kronstadt sailors took control of key infrastructure in the city, and then they moved against the provisional government. The Winter Palace was surrounded by the Petrograd garrison. They were supported by the Kronstadt sailors, who had arrived on board the Aurora battleship. Members of the provisional government were then arrested on the 26th of October after the Winter Palace was stormed by the Red Guards. This then led to the Bolsheviks taking control. Okay, so that completes the first two topic areas on one, the main cause and effects of the 1905 revolution, and two, the causes of revolution in 1917. It's important that you understand the causes that led to that February revolution in 1917, but then the October one. Okay, and it's important that we don't just have our knowledge. Remember, we have to analyze and evaluate. So I'm giving you a task here, complete as homework, or if you have any questions about it, we can discuss it in the Q&A at the live session. But I've given you things there that are causes of the October Revolution, and I want you to put them in a diamond 9. So I want you to decide where you put it. What would you say is the most important? So if you look there, I got the Tsar on there. Well, he is not the main cause of the October Revolution. He had abdicated in February. Okay, so you need to think about things like that, about the weakness of the provisional government, or the strengths of Trotsky or Lenin, or this Kornilov affair that gave them back their weapons and power. Okay. So, like I did with the last part, I want you to consider, right, do I know these things that are important for the cause of revolution in 1917? Okay, so you should know the political problems, the economic problems, World War I, these revolutionary groups. Do you know those and why they caused revolution in February 1917? Then also the causes of the October 1917 revolution. So the strengths of the Bolsheviks, okay, like Red Army under Trotsky and Lenin's April theses, or is it the weakness of the provisional government, unable to deal with problems? Is it the July days? Is it the Kornilov revolt? So I hope that's covered everything you want to know about the Russian Revolution from 1905 to 1917. Session 4 that I'll do next week, then we'll focus on civil war and the Bolshevik consolidation of power from 17 to 24, and then Stalin's political, social, and economic changes up to 1945. So we'll cover a bit of the impact of the Second World War on Russia as well then. So thank you for watching this session. If you have any questions about anything I've said on this, let me know in the live session next week with me and Mr. Morel. Thank you.